In our next session. Once again, good morning and thank you. Let me also just say thank you as people are getting settled. We had an incredible first session in this room and the energy is still clearly in the room with us. So we're going to carry that momentum forward. But let me say a note of appreciation for the panelists and for the audience for that session that we just had. It was wonderful. So good morning, my name is Maureen Elgersman Lee. I am director of the William Mary Bray School Lab, and it's my pleasure to serve as moderator for this session entitled Neat in Their Clothes, Utilizing Material Culture to Expand Black Women's Narratives. Our panelists today are Nicole Brown, Hope Wright, and Rachel Hogue, who will be speaking on different aspects of material culture, Black women's history and narratives, and also connection to the Williamsburg Bray School. Very briefly, the Williamsburg Bray School operated here in Williamsburg from 1760 to 1774. History was made last month when the building known as Bray Diggs House was moved from Prince George Street to the corner of Francis and Nassau Streets, its new permanent home in the historic area of colonial Williamsburg. That building housed the operations, or is what I call the educational enterprise of the Bray School for 5 years before the school really outgrew that 17 by 33 foot tenement building and moved to another location. That location, that building no longer exists, but we know that it actually is adjacent to the new permanent home of the Bray School. So history is still being called upon through documents and also through understanding the spatial history of the Bray School. Our research points to some 300 to potentially as many as 400 children having been educated at the Bray School. The youngest that we know of was 3, the oldest that we know of was 10. Both boys and girls were educated in writing, spelling, and perhaps writing. That debate is very strong still. Although leaning closer and closer to an understanding that they were in fact taught to write. Sewing and knitting, fine needle skills, rudimentary ability in mathematics also. So this is a robust history that is still being unpacked and we are searching, and today's panel is a reflection of the ongoing research and ongoing dedication to telling the full story, as we like to talk about, stories and structure. So each panelist will actually come to the podium for clarity and for, I think, a good experience for the audience. They will return to their seats when it comes to the question and answer session. And each speaker will speak no more than 15 minutes so that we really have time reserved for a robust conversation between panelists and audience. So I will welcome our first panelist, Ms. Nicole Brown. Mrs. Nicole Brown.
Good morning. It's lovely to be here. I'm honored to be here. And I also have to apologize. I didn't plan on coming in costume. I just happened to have a presentation right after this with the public, but maybe that also tells you a little bit about me. I'm the manager of core programming at Colonial Williamsburg. I'm a PhD student in American Studies at William and Mary, and I also portray Ann Wager, who was the sole teacher of the Williamsburg Bray School for its 14-year duration. So unsurprisingly, perhaps a topic that is very near and dear to my heart is material culture, but more importantly, how material culture and specifically sampler work can illuminate the ingenuity of the Black girls who attended the Williamsburg Bray School, while also furthering the argument, I feel, that writing was taught at the Williamsburg Bray School. And there are lots of different ways to come about it, sometimes through slate and pencil, sometimes through needle and thread. So my hope is to talk today a little bit about archives, where they silence Black women in the history of the Bray School, and how material culture, specifically sampler work, can re-illuminate and put those young Black girls back at the foreground of the narrative rather than the background. So I'll try to be as succinct as possible. When you're looking at the archive of the Associates of Dr. Bray, there are lots of different sources you can pull from, but perhaps the largest single collection in a group together is at the University of Oxford. I had the very great pleasure 4 years ago going to look at this collection, and actually I went back in January and presented to the British Society for 18th Century Studies on how they can use this collection in social justice and recovery efforts at the University of Oxford. Regardless, the collection is held specifically at Weston Library, which is the special collections library at the University of Oxford. There are lots of libraries there. Specifically, the Associates of Dr. Bray, today they're seen as a subset for the United Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. This organization ran from 1699 until 1979. And after that, it collapsed and was subsumed by the USPG, the abbreviation for the United Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Regardless, when I went 4 years ago, I photographed 8,445 images, and that was a quarter of what was in the collection of the archive. It's a vast collection that includes lists of students, a catalog of books that spans from 1753 to 1817 of everywhere they shipped books in the world, student lists, letters, the list goes on. However, as I always like to say with the undergraduates I work with, if I were to only look at this collection, that would still be an erasure, because no one collection can hold everything. And that has a great deal to do with the fact that archives are, well, biased. And in particular with the Associates of Dr. Bray. So the Associates of Dr. Bray were the charitable organization that sponsored the Williamsburg Bray School. I get this question a lot, but they actually paid for the school in its entirety over its 14-year tenure, although much to their chagrin, because they wrote quite a few letters to the enslavers in Williamsburg saying, quote, "They will have a dreadful account to give on the last day," end quote, because they would not pay for the Bray School. Regardless, the Associates came about because they were not only the third largest charity in the Church of England, the official church in Virginia prior to the American Revolution, but specifically because they were one of the projects of a man named Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray, who may be the most famous Anglican you've never heard of. And I include myself in that prior to this research. Many people thought he would be the first bishop of North America as early as 1702. This did not happen, but he founded the three largest charities in the Church of England: the United Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which I have mentioned, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, and the Bray Associates. And the Bray Associates were specifically meant to Christianize, or in their opinion, Anglicanize those of African, African-American, as we would call them today, and Indigenous or Native American descent. I include this as well when it comes to the portrait. The portrait is by William Verlist. It's the Georgia Trustees, because actually they helped the organization get on its legs initially. So the Associates of Dr. Bray had a very large financial contribution given to them in the early 18th century, but no royal charter from the crown and the king saying, "We sanction you across the empire to do X, Y, or Z." The Georgia Trustees had a royal charter, but very little money. And as it turns out, James Oglethorpe, who founded the Georgia Trustees, was a very good friend of Thomas Bray. So they combined forces for the first 20 years. And actually, most of the gentlemen you see in this portrait, or many of them, may have been some of the first Bray associates. But that's also why I include this portrait here, because again, it conceals as much as it reveals. The title is technically the Georgia Trustees. Why is it not a portrait of Tomochichi with the Yamacraw Nation, a confederation of Upper Creek and Yamasee? They're equally in the portrait, but they're not centered in the title of the portrait. It's a perfect example for how there is silence in archives, even when things are looking at us right in the face. And that's why material culture is important. It's actually why archives are important too. Even though they can limit us, they can also expand us. Sometimes I think, especially when I am out portraying, I wish I had that one document, you know, that one, you all know the one in your own archive that you need. And I get frustrated. And then I remember what Leslie Harris said in her wonderful article called Historical Imagination and the Perfect Archives, which is there is no perfect archive where every historical question is answered neatly and without the need for interpretation and imagination. There are only more or less difficult archives. And that's how I like to see the Bray School. What we know about the young Black girls who went to this school may be limited in the written record, but it does not mean that it is limited in what we actually know. If you approach it from an interdisciplinary standpoint, oral history, genealogy, and of course, material culture. So why do this? Because silences naturally exist in archives. One of my favorite works, Michel Roth-Triot, Silencing the Past, Power and Production of History. He talks about how archives create uneven narratives just based on either explicit or implicit bias. The Bray Associates are a great example. I was flipping through their collection at Oxford, and I was very appreciative to the 19th century archivist who wrote all of his notes in pencil on the original ink and rag paper pages. But he cataloged it quite differently than I would have. That's an example of what I'm talking about. It's also why Michel Roth-Triot tells us we have to put different sources back into conversation with one another to truly understand our collective past. I really do think that material culture, I mean, I'm biased, but material culture is one of the best ways to do this. And I think I'm not, quite frankly, and never will be as prolific a writer as Marisa J. Fuentes or Taya Miles, but these two books are perfect examples of that if you're looking to continue your journey on reading with material culture and archival silence after today. Robert Duplessis also says perfectly that, in particular, he's talking about textiles, but material culture is a visual, even fugitive means of communication. And I think it's important we keep this in mind because much of the work, including sampler work, that the young Black girls at the Bray School were expected to do was not necessarily of their own accord or consent. Did they enjoy sewing? Did they find it laborious? Did they feel creative in the process? Did they realize it would increase their price point value so much that their enslavers would never free them? Likely all of those things. But that fugitive nature is hidden in the threads of samplers. So let's talk about that a little bit. When we look at the actual archive of the Bray Associates and you look at the regulations for the school, what you see is that the Bray Associates explicitly state they want to render the females more useful to their owners by instructing them in sewing, knitting, etc., and describe this work as, quote, proper for their sex. This is particularly interesting when you actually look at the demographics in Williamsburg. It's not an official census, but the 1775 records, Hope and I have talked about these quite a bit, of the community of Williamsburg, if you break them down not just by race, so if you break down the population by race, 52% of the population is Black, 48% is white. But if you take the Black population and divide it by gender, 57% of the population in Williamsburg is Black women. Let me say that one more time. If you break down the information by not just race, but gender, 57% of the Black population in Williamsburg in 1775 is Black women. They're expected to be laundresses, cooks, ladies' maids, and the skill and expertise, as well as the physical labor they are asked to do, is extraordinary. A lot of times I actually had this comment yesterday from a guest saying, oh, well, men did more labor than women. And I say that's not true. We'll talk about it more. I'm sure all of the presenters will, but it's important we keep that in mind. So with that, let's talk about some of that labor. Let's talk about some of that creativity. Let's talk about samplers. We are very, very fortunate actually at Colonial Williamsburg to have the national expert on 18th century sampler work. And in fact, if you want to see a great exhibit on samplers, we have one in our museum. These two come from this collection. And so I do want to give credit to Kim Ivey, who is the textile sampler curator at Colonial Williamsburg. She and I've had many conversations, and she's also written a book. She wrote it in 1997 called In the Neatest Manner, which is all about Virginia-specific samplers. So the two samplers you're looking at were done by young white girls in colonial or in 18th century Williamsburg, I should say. However, Kim has posited in her book, and this holds true to her research today, that sampler work is not based on race, but it is based on, and this comes directly from her book, the skill of what the teacher can teach and the ingenuity of the child. Samplers in 18th century America are extraordinarily regionally specific. So for example, Kim can tell the difference between a Norfolk sampler, an Isle of Wight sampler, and a Williamsburg sampler, and they all look different because teachers tend to stick to a particular region. They live, are born, and they die within a 50-mile radius oftentimes of where they grew up. So it really is based on individuality of teachers and students that lead to a continued line of different kinds of sampler work. This is why I have pulled the samplers of Ann Pastor Maupin and Mary Johnson, because they're on both ends of our time period for the Bray School. The Bray School ran between 1760 and 1774. We've got this sampler from 1741 and this one from 1791. And when I went to Kim and I said, Kim, I'm working on a book chapter with Tony Bly and Julie Richter on literacy in the Bray School. What samplers should I pull for the images? She said, these two. They're the best examples that are still extant and show you that similar skills are being taught over a 50-year time period. So one of the things you're seeing in both of these samplers, and in particular in the Mary Johnson sampler, is something called a marking stitch. So do you see Mary Johnson's name at the bottom in red, that big blocky letter? A marking stitch is a stitch that requires you to be able to count to 9 because it is perfectly reversible. And I've seen it. The back of this sampler looks as perfect as the front. You cannot tell me when young girls who are at the Bray School who are expected to know how to do marking stitches, to stitch the names and the initials and the numbers of their enslavers in their shifts to send them off for laundry, which is very common in 18th century Williamsburg, that these girls are not learning this skill. So what does that tell you? Well, first of all, they're doing arithmetic. They clearly know how to count. You can't do the stitch if you don't. But quite frankly, as somebody who's had to do samplers before, has anyone here had to make a sampler before? Yeah, my samplers aren't that good. And I'll be honest about that. They're perfectly reversible. You take so much time and effort in each tiny stitch that it is a form of writing. It's a form of literacy, but it's concealed because it's not how we traditionally think about writing or literacy in the 21st century. Another interesting motif, and I don't really have answers for this, but I am trying to explore it a little bit more, that Kim has seen time and time again in 18th century Williamsburg samplers, is not just the marking stitch and chain stitches in particular, which create a beautiful clear line. You can see those beautiful lines up the side of the Ann Pastor Maupin sampler. But there's one particular motif that's very common in Williamsburg, which is 2 trees on either side of Adam and Eve, standing in between the tree of knowledge with a serpent wrapped around it. I find that quite interesting, don't you? They are stitching biblical verses, they're stitching biblical motifs onto these samplers. So what about a girl at the Bray School who's maybe doing something like this in 1760? She's 10, and then she's 20 in 1770, and then she's 30 in 1780, and then she's 40 in 1790. What is the legacy of that kind of motif and the creative imagination of this woman's mind? I don't have answers for that. In fact, we may never have answers for that, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't ask the question. So with that, I will leave you to think about your own questions that these samplers bring up in you. And I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Now, as I give my presentation, I want you to think about the runaway ad. That's an example of the hundreds of thousands that were printed in newspapers during the time history was legal in this country. And they give you some good descriptions, but I'm also going to put this jacket on a chair so you all can have a look at that. This is a cloth that's very, very typical, very, very common of women that had to work, white, Black, free or enslaved, made by my dear friend and colleague, Nicole. And as you look at that, think about the women that would have worn it and think about them during this presentation. My name is Hope Wright, and I began working at Colonial Williamsburg as an 8-year-old third grader. So I'm not sure if the gentleman is still here who asked about what Colonial Williamsburg is doing as far as teaching Black history. I can't speak to the foundation, but I can say that folks like myself who have been there for 39 years, one of my mentors and dear friends, Janice Canada, who's been there for 20 plus, probably close to 30 years. My husband in the back, who has been there for 15 years. I can tell you that we are Black people who do it every day, that we are here. So we are there. When I started here, this actually began my introduction to the study of material culture and through Runaway ads. I actually started working in costume almost immediately in a program called On Mine Own Time. Now, does anybody remember the old Williamsburg Lodge? And the old Williamsburg Lodge had a theater connected to it. Is there anybody that's here that remembers that? So it's a few people. And it was a series of scenes that looked at the lives of free and enslaved Black people as individuals, not what they did, not who they were owned by, but as individuals. And actually one of the very first historic figures that I portrayed was a student at the Bray School named Alicia Jones. In addition to performing, I also participated in training and classes beginning at 8 that were very similar to classes I had at the collegiate level when I was here as a student at the College of William and Mary just a few short years ago. These Runaway ads were some of the first primary sources that I ever studied. Running away was something that seemed to me at that age fascinating, dangerous, and brave. And the descriptions in some of the ad were so vivid that the people being described, they just seemed to jump off the page. This started a lifelong interest in these documents that continues 39 years later. Now, while these documents give us vivid and detailed descriptions of individuals who sought to gain freedom and flee their bondage, it's always important to acknowledge, as my colleague Nicole pointed out, that bias exists in these ads. Some are more derogatory than others. Some are patronizing and condescending. Some of them are terribly violent. But all of these ads were placed by men and women enslavers for their enslaved people who simply wanted to leave their enslavement and enjoy freedom for just a moment, no matter how temporary. In Williamsburg, prior to the Revolutionary War, the permanent population was made up of a little less than 2,000 people. Nearly 53% of that population was made up of people of African descent. The vast majority of them were enslaved, and a majority of them were women. This means that there were more Black women in Williamsburg than Black men, white women, or white men. You will hear this statistic a lot. Why? Because that is rarely, if ever, the picture painted of the town in the 18th century. So Colonial Williamsburg would have looked a lot like me. The lives of these Black women are often viewed through their enslavement and through their work. They are often viewed as nameless and faceless. It is rare that many stop to think about these countless women as individuals, but we do, however, have a resource that gives us the insight into a select group of enslaved women, and that is those who ran away. There were hundreds of thousands of enslaved women who self-liberated during the 200 plus years that slavery was legal in this country. Many of these women ran to live lives as free individuals, to visit family members, or to run with families so that they could keep these units intact. Or they ran to seek transportation to other areas. When these women absconded, their owners would place runaway advertisements in area newspapers. These ads gave the name of women, the date they ran, and sometimes where they intended to go. But these advertisements also gave very detailed descriptions of these women, what they wore, what they took with them, what their hair looked like, etc.
For owners, it was important to be specific and thorough when advertising the women that ran. This might help ensure that these women were known, could be noticed, and could eventually be captured. But for us, these can give us vivid portraits of each of these women and inform us of their family and romantic connections, personality traits, skills, what language they spoke. Studying women who ran also gives us insights into the lives of enslaved women overall, including the Black women who resided right here in Williamsburg, and the enslaved girls who grew into women that attended the Williamsburg Bray School. Now, when Zilpha, a Negro woman from Norwich, Connecticut, ran away in 1778, she carried with her one brown camlet gown almost new, one black tammy ditto, one blue and white figured stuff ditto, one dark calico ditto partly worn, one striped linen ditto almost new, one black calamanco quilt almost new, one flowered lawn apron, one red broadcloth cloak almost new, one brown camlet riding hood partly worn, one black satin bonnet almost new, with a variety of other articles consisting of caps, handkerchiefs, shoes, stockings, and ribbons. That's one woman. That's what she carried with her. The amount and variety of clothes she took with her when she ran off was not uncommon. Jenny from Philadelphia took with her a bundle of clothes consisting of one light chintz gown, a small figure with red stripes, one dark ditto with a large flower and yellow stripes, 7 yards of new stamped linen, a purple striped flower, pink colored Maureen petticoat, one new black pelong bonnet, a chip hat trimmed with gauze and feathers, 4 good shifts, 2 not made up and 2 a little worn, 4 aprons, 2 white and 2 check, 1 pair of blue worsted shills with heels. She is quite fond of dress, particularly of wearing queen's nightcaps. She had in her shoes a large pair of silver buckles. Now, I just want to say, I am fortunate enough to be able to portray a woman by the name of Betty, who sought to self-liberate in a program that we do at Colonial Williamsburg called She Had On When She Went Away. And so Betty took with her about a quarter of the clothes that these 2 women took. So I want you to think about this as being a Black woman who's already vulnerable in society, who is making her escape, trying to elude capture, carrying these clothes with her. And when we talk about the weight of these clothes, we're talking sometimes about hundreds of pounds of clothing. And I was talking to a dear colleague of mine who's still new. When we tend to think about people that ran away, it's not that they ran away, got one place and said, well, I live here now and I'm free. And that was where they lived for the rest of their lives. Think about this as something that was tenuous, where you're always looking over your shoulder, whether you were running to reunite with family, not knowing whether it could be permanent, whether you're running to places like the Dismal Swamp, integrating yourselves into maroon communities. You ran there because nobody would come to look after you, whether you were running to find work on a ship and travel somewhere else, or whether you were running to hide in plain sight in a big city like Williamsburg would have been in the 18th century. This is something that was tenuous, never permanent, and never assured. So just keep that in mind. This wardrobe that these women had was something that was acquired over time. And think about these things. These were garments that you would make, you could purchase, you could trade for, you could restyle. And dress, this was an area where women commonly asserted authority and autonomy over themselves. They could also maintain cultural retentions, and they also developed brand new African-American customs by repurposing garments. Handkerchiefs were used to tie up hair, and men's shoes, hats, and coats were all worn by women. Daphne from Fells Point, Maryland, ran away in a pair of men's pumps. Lear had a white lawn handkerchief, which she wore around her head. Joyce wore a red handkerchief tied around her head, and Fanny absconded wearing a man's hat. Now, when women ran away, in addition to the large quantity of clothes they took with them, they also took their most valuable possessions. And for many of them, this often included jewelry. Again, something that was not commonly thought about when you think about the things that enslaved people had in their possession. For many of these women, not only did the value hold monetary value, it was also of cultural as well as spiritual importance. A new Negro woman, whose name is not recorded in history, ran away from New York in July of 1763. She had beads around her arm, beads around her neck. Saltwater women like Chloe and Candace, along with a 3-year-old boy, Jack, all wore beads when they ran away from Rock Creek, Maryland in 1770. And new and saltwater, these were terms that were used in the 18th century to describe African-born people who were just coming into the colony. The use of beads by many African peoples is quite common, and it is something that survives through many, many generations. Evidence survives in slave burial grounds of individuals being interred with beads, and right in colonial Williamsburg, it is the site of the American Indian encampment now, but it was also referred to as the Ravenscroft site, where we know beads as well as cowrie shells were found. Sarah from Buckingham County wore 2 rings on her fingers, and Hannah, who ran from Newark, New Jersey, wore a gilt chain and locket. However, by far the most common type of jewelry found in these runaway ads were earrings, or as they were often referred to in 18th century advertisements, and also my grandfather would call them this, ear bobs. Sal, an enslaved woman originally from Maryland who ran from Bourbon County, Kentucky, wore stone bobs in her ears of a blue and white color, hung in with the silk thread. Betty from Hanovertown in Virginia wore silver earrings set with white stones. Phyllis from Boston wore gold bobs in her ears. Prussia from New York wore gold wires in her ears. And even 5-year-old Alcy, who ran from Wando, South Carolina with her mother and brother, wore silver drops in her ears. Now, the descriptions of clothing and jewelry of enslaved women by their masters and mistresses were usually straightforward and objective, a recounting of objects that was specific and usually without judgment. However, when describing these same women and their hair, there was a range from subjective, patronizing, and derogatory to descriptive, detailed, and direct. Quite often, the hair of these women was referred to as wool. Lizzie is described as having a long, woolly head, and Hannah had a remarkable long hair or wool. Hair and wool were synonymous, but many ads also do refer to the characteristics of hair. The texture of hair is mentioned in ads as well. Annis, who ran from Northampton County, North Carolina, had straight hair. Peggy had a bushy head. Dinah, who escaped from Warren, Rhode Island, had curled hair. 12-year-old Elsie, who ran to be with her mother in Alexandria, Virginia, had tolerable straight hair. Dosia, described as a very bright mulatto, almost white, had very coarse hair. The texture of hair recounted in these ads is as varied as much as the women who ran away. There were also descriptions of the color of hair. Moll, who lived in New Kent County, Virginia, had brown hair. Violetus, a 32-year-old woman who ran from Bridgewater, Massachusetts, had hair of a yellowish color. Alice had rather sandy hair. Fanny had long red hair. Betty from Essex, Virginia, was gray-headed. And Anastasia, who ran from the District of Columbia, had black hair. Elsa from Raleigh, North Carolina, had very black hair. The variety of textures and colors that existed in these descriptions of runaway women in no way compared to the variety of hairstyles that these women also wore. Phoebe wore her long black hair generally clubbed, or in a knot or tail worn at the back of the head. Moll, who lived near Baltimore, generally wore her head filletted, which is a type of braid using ribbon, string, or strips of material to bind her hair for ornamentation. Rhoda, and this is one of my favorites, who was born in New England but absconded from Edenton, North Carolina, wore her hair combed over a large roll. So think of that as a pompadour. And this one, Jane Wilson, usually wore her hair tied up on a knot on the crown of her head. So the top knot, things that we are still doing today. Kate, a native of Long Island, generally wears her hair very high and straight up over a large roll with a great deal of pomatum. And Charlotte, who ran from Norfolk, Virginia, wore her hair, which is of a sandy complexion, constantly plaited. The assortment of styles listed here is just a small illustration of the ways in which these women fashion their hair. The information here, it only begins to scratch the surface of what can be learned about the material culture, not only of these enslaved women who ran, but of every enslaved woman. Just keep that in mind. Their clothing, their jewelry, their hair, everything that made up their material culture. But more than anything, these ads tell us about the humanity of these Black women. Like one of my favorite runaway ads is of a woman named Tab who ran away with only the clothes on her back, but thought to bring with her a little white dog whose name was Fan. While using these ads as references, it is always important to remember that these women were in pursuit of freedom, liberty, and the opportunity to live their lives on their own terms. We have these ads and these wonderful resources for the ugliest of reasons. But it is because so many women took that chance that we have these amazing resources that highlight their ability, their knowledge, and their humanity. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Rachel. I'm an undergraduate student at William & Mary. I'm a junior studying history. I'm also working to get my NIAD certificate. So NIAD is the National Institute of American History and Democracy. And our certificate on campus is in material culture and public history. So that's kind of where I come from, the research side of things. I'm also a Bray School student thought partner. So I've been working with the lab on some transcription projects, as well as some writing for the blog over the course of about 1.5 years. And I also spent last summer working at Colonial Williamsburg in historic trades. I had an internship in the millinery shop. So I was working in the historic trade of millinery, which is essentially accessory making in the 18th century. And so doing a lot of hand sewing. And so with my work with the Bray School initiative, as well as working at Colonial Williamsburg, I wanted to do something that could combine both of those projects in the form of a tangible piece of material culture. So exploring how reproduction material culture, so remaking items that are appropriate for the 18th century as a way to fully interpret Black women's history. So I'm actually going to bring back up that quote that Nicole had in her presentation, because that quote is exactly where I started last summer when I was going to work on this project. We have this one line that the students at the Bray School, the female students at the Bray School, are being taught sewing and knitting and such other things. Sewing in the 18th century includes a lot of things. It can be different trades, it can be millinery, it can be making even the sails to a ship. So sewing is in every part of life in the 18th century. And that labor is going to factor directly into that education at the Bray School. So I took this source and looked at it and thought, how exactly can we use this action from the archive, a silencing archive, a biased archive, and bring it into tangible material culture to help interpret these stories? So my answer for that actually came from another source from 1789. So in 1789, a book is published in London called Dressing the Poor. And essentially what it is an instruction manual. So it's a manual that is created for other schools or charity schools back in England. And essentially this is for people who are wanting to donate or make things for these schools. And it's giving them instructions on the type of fabric, the measurements, and the different supplies you would need to build up those garments and then give them to the school. One in particular page was interesting to us in the shop while I was working because it focuses on work bags. A work bag in the 18th century is a pretty ubiquitous piece of material culture. Most likely every woman, regardless of her place in society, would have had one because it's where you keep your sewing tools. It's where you throw your thimble and your scissors and your thread and your project that you're working on. And it's simply a small drawstring bag. We use them in our shop every day when we're working in Colonial Williamsburg. And so this page is telling us that when a young girl at one of these schools completes her first pair of stockings, so using that skill of knitting that we also know that the students at the Bray School are learning, she gets a bag as reward. And what this particular reference was fascinating to me is that when that child receives that bag, her name is inked upon it on a small piece of white linen. This means that when we recreated this bag, and I have a few to show at the end of my presentation, it meant that we could take those names from the archive of the Bray School, these little student lists that we refer to almost every time that we do our research in the Bray School. And we could take those names and we could put them on something tangible, something that we can hand the public and say, these are the stories that you're going to hear when we talk about the Bray School. These are the students' names. So the process of making this bag involved taking the instructions here and their 18th century language and applying them to the sewing skills that I was learning. So I committed to that process of taking my fingers and my thimbles and my thread into making those bags. So we made 3. I actually just completed 2 of them yesterday, so I will show those in just a second. And in the process of making this bag, I actually focused on Nancy. Nancy is a child who is attending the Bray School in the 1760s, and she's enslaved by Mr. Charlton. Mr. Charlton actually is going to live right across the street from the shop and where I sewed these bags. His wife, Jane Charlton, is a milliner. So directly related to the trades in which I was making these bags, the trade that's going to be selling these types of objects. And so Nancy's bag was the first one we made this summer. And it was a really exciting day when we were able to create this bag and then present it directly to the public to say, this is this story. Let's talk about Nancy. Let's talk about her education at the Bray School. So this was going to be my last slide, but now that I've finished some more of the bags, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those. But I wanted to show this picture because this picture actually shows the Charlton House directly behind that bag that I made for Nancy. What we're looking at is we're looking at the Williamsburg kind of geography matching up with those stories and allowing us to kind of tell these fuller stories and these narratives of these female students that attended the school. And I wanted to close also with this quote by Saidiya Hartman. I think it's really important to see how stories and historical imagination and how we apply that historical imagination is an amazing form of methodology for us to use as we flesh out these fuller narratives of Black women's histories. So the bags that I brought here today are the school bags, the work bags, the sewing bags of Mary Ashby, Nancy, and Hannah. They may have carried bags very similar to these as they walked from their respective households to the Bray School. They may have tucked half-finished projects into them. In Hannah's, we even have a piece of sampler work, exactly as Nicole described in her presentation. It's perfectly identical on the back. It's unfinished. There's a story to be told there as well. I really appreciate the way that reproduction material culture can tell these stories because we also get to recreate the actual making of these objects. I can talk about how, as I learned, the herringbone stitch, which is that stitch that goes right around that nameplate, is not very easy. And it's something that I can imagine students in the Bray School, if they were learning that, they probably did a much better job than I did. Or maybe they didn't enjoy that labor and they chose to tuck away those projects into those bags and stop them. And that would have been far more of an act of resistance than me finishing these bags in the shop. So that was the project that I got to work on this past summer. And it's an ongoing project. Even just yesterday, as I finished these bags in front of the public, I was able to answer more questions about Hannah and Mary and Nancy's stories and bringing up all of the other students of the Bray School as well. So, thank you.
Let me say thank you again to all our panelists. We're going to move into the question and answer conversation portion of the session. But let me say just a couple of things. Nicole, who started off the presentations, wears a lot of hats. One hat she forgot to mention, in fact, is that she is lab assistant for the Bray School lab. She is a critical part of the lab. She particularly works closely with our student thought partners who are also essential. Rachel is one of our kind of pioneering group of student thought partners. Let me also acknowledge Ethan Miller, who is in the room as well. You might have seen him at the checkout table earlier this morning. He is also a thought partner. Are there any other student thought partners present? Celia. She is or she was?
She is, yeah.
Okay, all right. So want to acknowledge all our student thought partners. I'm going to ask a question to get us started and particularly give time for mics to get set up and for mics to get in hands of people who have other questions. But I do want to mention a couple things before I ask that question. Everyone on the panel, in addition to being part of the Lemon Project today, are also people who have committed to write for the Bray School book. We have a book that we are working on called The Williamsburg Bray School, A Community Speaks to Its Past. There are 7 primary documents that sketch out the history of the Bray School, and attached to each of those documents will be reflections, short essays of reflection written by various individuals, all of whom are on the panel today. I mentioned that to say we are actively engaging and working to find more descendants of the Bray School. So please, before you leave the session today, if you know your family to be connected to children who went to the Bray School or sometimes not a straight line connection to the Bray School history, if you know that your family might have been, or if you simply know that your family is represented by many people in this room and attending this symposium this weekend, that your family has deep, deep roots in Williamsburg and the surrounding area, because we know families did not stay necessarily in one place, or they stayed in Williamsburg, but also those branches, right, grew out outside of Williamsburg. But if you fit into any of those categories, we really would like to connect with you. So please, before you leave this session today, we would love to speak with you and certainly have a way to follow up with you and certainly let you know what else is going on. And if you're just interested by and large in what's happening, please also let us capture that information so that we can continue to be in touch with you. But that being said, my first question is actually directed to Nicole. Nicole, can you explain why Neat in Their Clothes was chosen as a title for the panel?
Yes, I can. So Neat in Their Clothes specifically also comes from the Williamsburg Bray School rules, which if you're actually interested in reading for yourself and soon listening to for yourself, we're doing audio recordings of all of our documents. If you go to the research portal page for the Bray School Lab, it'll take you there. So this is on page 7 of the school rules. And they're talking about the attire of the enslaved boys and girls who are attending the school. And they say that the teacher and wager will keep them neat in their clothes. This particular description I find interesting because they go on to describe the fact that they would like a uniform for all of the Bray School students to other them from other children. And this idea of keeping them neat in their clothes, the idea that the children wouldn't be neat in their clothes in the first place, I think also speaks to some of the points that Hope brought up about runaway ads, the biases of people who are writing this particular set of rules. So that's why we actually picked it, because we've been working with the millinery, the tailor shop, other material culture experts to try to figure out, were these students wearing a uniform? If so, what did it look like? And more importantly, what does this comment say about the materiality of these children in their day-to-day lives, whether they're attending Bruton Parish, whether they're going down to Raccoon's Chase and worshiping with their parents, or anywhere else they travel through the city.
Yeah, all right. So questions, happy to take questions from the audience, and I'm sure our panelists will be happy to respond.
This question is for Rachel. I heard you say that you at times got an opportunity to interact with guests and they had a chance to view the project. So I just want to know if when they're asking you questions and you're engaged in conversation with them, did you get any indication that the project and what you were talking about helped them to realize their humanity while they were talking to you about that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and thank you so much for that question, because actually just yesterday, I had a really fascinating conversation with a guest who came in and did not prior know about the Bray School or the project. They had seen the building move, but didn't entirely know what that was about. And having the bags on the table actually allowed them to ask that question. They simply just asked, what is this? And then we got into a really interesting conversation where we actually did talk about, specifically, we brought up the word humanity and how an object can bring that tangibility of a full life back to these historical spaces, especially talking about Hannah. We know that she was actually quite good at math. And so we talked about how maybe her stitches might have been more precise than maybe Mary or Nancy's, because she had kind of that precision in her work. In fact, that we talked about how the process of recreation actually might be different for each bag with what we do know about individual students. And that's exactly what we got to talk about. So thank you for bringing up that word humanity, because that's exactly what these objects can help us do.
Rachel, can you say a little more about Hannah? She's interesting student and has I think there's some more to say about Hannah.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
So as
And
far as my
Nicole could jump in
memory will
too.
serve me, yes, you're good enough, because as you could tell when Nicole mentioned the page number, she has these almost memorized. And Hope and I, we're getting there. But Hannah was enslaved by Robert Carter Nicholas. And so he's actually the man that's writing many of these letters and these school rules as a Bray Associate. And so Hannah is not only a student at the Bray School, but someone that we know a little bit more about just because we have documents written, unfortunately, by her enslaver that can give us, when we read between the lines, a little bit more information about her life. But it also means that she would have intimately known what's happening with the Bray School beyond just being a student. She's going to be in the household where these decisions are being made about what needing their clothes really meant. She would know exactly what that meant because she's in the household that's deciding what that's going to be.
Yeah, so to give a little more context to that, Hannah first appears in the written record for the Williamsburg Bray School in the student list that is connected to the school rules. So September 29th, 1762. She's being listed as 7 years old when she goes to the school. Part of my master's thesis work, and I'm hoping moving forward with my dissertation, is going to be exploring Hannah and her humanity in more detail and really making the written record reckon with those silences. Because actually Robert Carter Nicholas does reference her obliquely in another letter on December 27th of 1765. He doesn't mention her by name, but doing arithmetic and lining up these documents. This is why Michel Rough-Trio's theories on stages of silence and archives is so important, because you can actually pair, or in some cases pit, primary sources that are biased against or with each other to illuminate more things about, in this case, Hannah. So he writes in December and says, he's writing to the Bray Associates and essentially saying, hey, the school is not working the way you thought it was going to. If you were hoping this was going to make obedient enslaved individuals, you're wrong. And he says, quote, I have a Negro girl in my family who went to the school upwards of 3 years, and she made as good progress as most, notwithstanding all of our attempts to reform her, end quote. So what that tells you is that Hannah is using her instruction in some way, not only antithetical to that of her enslaver, but enough that he is irritated, angry, curious, whatever motivation, to write about it anonymously to somebody he's never met in London. I find that very interesting. So that's where Hannah appears on the record. Fortunately, I'm Elizabeth Drembus, who is the genealogist at the Bray School Lab. We have a full-time genealogist and oral historian. We're all going to be working together as a team to try to learn more about Hannah and all the other Bray School children who attended the school. But that's where she shows up in the written record. And if you'd like to see someone portray her, Deirdre Jones Cardwell and I co-developed a program with Jeremy Morris. It's going to be this summer on Thursdays called Re-Educate. And it's at narratives. We spent 3 years working on this, combing through archives, but perspectives they bring as children and adults of Bray School students and how those were antithetical to their teacher. So we do a whole program on that. And Deirdre spent quite a bit of time with you, Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong, learning more about marking stitches and counting so that she could do that historical imagination piece in her script.
I would like to actually say that Janae Whitaker, who's the supervisor at the millinery, is really the one that helped Deirdre, because I've never done a sampler in my life. And so she knows what she's doing with that. I do not.
I was just going to say, if you can get to the program, see the program first and foremost. But I think the wonderful thing that we know about these students is that we have names of about 90.
Yeah.
90 students, possibly 400. But for those students where we have any additional information about them, we know that they all resisted in some way, shape, or form the teachings that they were being given. So to hear Nicole talk about, hey, this school isn't working the way that we thought it was. Hey, this isn't, this isn't doing what you had in mind, that they were receiving this instruction from Miss Wager, to tell them basically to be better slaves to their masters, to be obedient, to obey. But once you teach them, once you light that spark, once you teach them how to read, once you teach them arithmetic, mathematics, once you teach them that, there's nothing you can do to contain what they do. And there's even evidence perhaps that Hannah is teaching other people that might not have had a chance to go to the school, maybe other children, maybe other adults, but that even sitting in this classroom and getting that certain type of instruction year after year after year, these students were bright, they were clever, they had their own minds, they drew their own conclusions, they knew their humanity. They knew their humanity, and they resisted at every turn. And I just think that's the amazing thing when you really think about it. They resisted as children, they resisted into adulthood, they became the bedrocks of the Black Williamsburg community. So I think that's amazing, especially with the panel in front of us. The Black community existed in here. Yes, as free individuals after the Civil War, but the Black community was here 200 years before that. And these students shed light on that.
Thank you. To be clear, the Bray School was a pro-slavery institution. We want to be really clear. We are not in any way interested in romanticizing the history of the school. So let me just be clear for those who perhaps are not as familiar with the Bray School history as others. We know it opened in 1760, closed in 1774. It had a single teacher during those 14 years, Ann Wager. When Ann Wager died in August of 1774, the school closed. It did not reopen in 1777. The Bray Associates are divesting from Williamsburg and other Bray schools. We are in the midst of the revolution by that point. So we have to underscore this was a pro-slavery institution. The Anglican faith teachings that were delivered very much through that lens. And we also don't want to romanticize the operations of the school in terms of the ideals of the goals for the school and the reality of trying to reach those goals. And also even just from a financial perspective, very quickly, Nicole mentioned the really significant quote concerning that you will have an account to be made of yourself at the day of judgment for not really kind of securing the future of the Bray School, that being directed to enslavers who were sending children to the Bray School. There was never a tuition for the school. The Bray Associates funded the school to a certain degree for most of the financial needs of the school. And when it became apparent that that budget was increasingly falling short of the needs, the Bray Associates put that responsibility back on the trustees and suggested that they start a subscription that is requiring senders to pay a fee for these children. And Robert Carter Nicholas is very clear. If you ask them to pay, they will not pay, and the school will in fact cease. So there's some very interesting tensions that run throughout the history of the school, and we are not romanticizing any of those. We really want to tell the stories accurately as we can. So just want to add that. I know we have more questions, so microphone.
I know we're running out of time, and I want to start by saying that I am overwhelmed with the research that's been done. I applaud it, but I also want to know what happened after 1865. Where are the documents about the materials that were used? What about the white women? What materials did they use? Where did they learn? I'm sorry, where did they learn the skills? And what happened to those skills? What materials did they use? There could have been people that enjoyed doing that. I'm one of those people. And I think that we're missing a whole chunk of both white and Black history in just this one topic.
So if I'm hearing your question correctly, you're wondering, as we move into the 19th century and the 20th century, where is that history? The answer is we're still doing research on that right now. Obviously, the larger Williamsburg community has a history and a legacy with material culture and materiality. But right now, I'm actually working with a group of students called the Standing in the Gap Project, where they're trying to do research to figure out what happens in between the Bray School shutting down and the legacy of what's happening at that school in the wider Williamsburg community. The difficulty that we have is when the school shuts down in 1774, anything and everything about the Bray School, they cease writing about it. Robert Carter Nicholas ceases writing about it, and he's the sole correspondent. So we know that there are connections in the wider community, but we have to now go into hundreds of different archives to pull that all back together. So the answer to your question is we're still working on it. And I think it's a good question for that reason. Who did we consult?
Let me just say, the question was, who did you consult concerning the stitches?
Yep.
Right. Just so that everyone can know what the question is. All right. So we're going to answer that.
Yeah, so I can answer that. We worked specifically with Kim Ivey, who is the national expert on 18th century sampler work. So most of these samplers are going to be linen with a silk thread. It really doesn't change until 1820 moving forward. You see more wool after that. But she has literally traveled the country over the last 30 years collecting samplers and sampler work, ranging from the early 18th century all the way into about the 1840s. I've also been working with the curator of the Nova Scotia Museum, because there is actually a Bray School sampler done by a Bray School student from 1842 in Nova Scotia. No direct links yet with that family to the Williamsburg Bray School, but their family actually did self-emancipate during the War of 1812 from Virginia, specifically Richmond. We're also looking at the work of previous textile historians and material culturists. And of course, the milliners are one of our best experts on 18th century stitches, marking stitch, chain stitch. And I have also been trying to not just read and learn more, but practice myself. So I have 3 samplers in work right now to try to learn more about those stitches specifically. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Yeah, we also have a question
Right,
online that I would like to ask.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, we'll come to you next. You have a question? Okay. All right. Many women, and this is from Yvonne Johnson. Many of the women in the descendant community made quilts. Was there any record of the children in the Bray School learning to quilt?
Oh, great question. Right now, the question to that answer is no. However, I think this is an ongoing conversation. Again, the issue that we are running into is we don't actually know or have direct lines for some of the enslaved individuals directly after the Bray School closed. We are working with members of the Ashby family and the Jones family to learn and discuss more about their families, and members of those families are also writing for our Bray School book. But right now, my guess is quilts probably did link up in some way with the sewing work, but I cannot directly link it through multiple different archives because we simply have not had the opportunity to dive into all of those archives yet. That's going to be a work that's going to require not just all of us on this stage, but the community, hopefully, to help us through that process.
Okay, I have 2 questions. One for Nicole. I know we've been talking about the sewing and the knitting for the young girls. Was there a similar type training for the young boys, or was that not at the Bray School?
This is a really great question. And again, I'm still trying to learn more about it. We know that likely the young boys are learning to write using slate and slate pencil. Now that comes from the archaeology rather than the written record. And in fact, what's really interesting, they found, oh gosh, I want to say almost 400,000 artifacts on the archaeology site, but not all of them have been processed yet. It's going to take 5-10 years to process all of them. So I also hope as we move forward, I can give you more complex answers as we move forward, because so much of the data we have is raw data rather than processed data, if that makes sense, both in written record and archives. But it seems that slate and slate pencils may likely have been used on the site. It also has the largest number of clay marbles found anywhere in Williamsburg. Clay marbles can be used for play. They can also be used for arithmetic. And our archaeologist is trying to do more research on that right now, Ashley McHouston. However, I do find it interesting that in the school rules, sewing is a ubiquitous skill, as Rachel said. If you're living out in the middle of nowhere and you have 50 acres, you're not going to split your britches and go, well, I really wish there was a woman here to do this for me, right? Simultaneously, the archive silences the sewing work that any boys at the school may have learned because they gender it. They say this is specifically for girls. And so it's also one of those things I want to explore in more detail as well. Were any boys learning sewing work or sampler work? We just recently, again, over the last 5 years, I've been processing documents on multiple different Bray schools across British North America, but we have about 5,000 pages of transcription ahead of us. So again, I hope if you ask me that question in a year, we have a more comprehensive answer for you.
Okay, and quick question for Hope. I read a book about an enslaved woman who was a runaway from George Washington, and she was pursued relentlessly. Do you know about that particular?
I think that was Never Caught, and it was about Ona Judge. So that I think that is what you're talking about, and that's a really interesting case. How she was pursued, and it seems like it was advertised by George Washington, but driven more than anything by Martha Washington and her desire to have her back within the household and within that enslavement. But if anybody is interested in looking more into these runaway ads, because like I said, they're very fascinating. A wonderful site is the Geography of Slavery.
Yes.
And that's one that I recommend because it's free and open access. A lot of them are behind paywalls, and if you don't, have subscriptions, but the Geography of Slavery is free, open, and you can search if you just want to see what women ran away in 1757. You can do it that way if you want to look by trade, if you want to see women who were new, and coming into the colonies from Africa or elsewhere, you can do it. So it's good, searchable Geography of Slavery.
All right, we have a question.
Yes, I have a comment and then a question. Now, because of me knowing how you can speak to people at Colonial Williamsburg to go see programs, they'll say yes and don't show up. So let me drive this home. Please go see Re-Educate. You'll thank me later. Get there like 5 minutes early. And my question is for Nicole. Now, please forgive me, I had to run to the restroom. But did you give the 18th century English definition of education?
Oh, no, I didn't. And
Yeah,
actually,
I think that just may drive it home a little bit more. Thank you so much for your patience.
yeah, so I'll see if I can remember it directly from memory from the OED. I'm pretty sure I can. So in the 18th century, education is defined according to the British Empire very differently than how we define education today. I should also preface this with that this was the standard definition in the OED from 1531 to 1844. The process of bringing up, the manner in which a young person is brought up with reference to social station, kind of manners or habits acquired, or calling or employment prepared for. This is also one of the reasons that we're doing a lot more research. Well, I did remember that from memory. That's great. This is also one of the reasons why the research, when it comes to not just material culture and Black women and girls in the Bray School, the legacy of it into the 19th and 20th century, but the 18th century is so difficult and new because enslavers are intentionally erasing where the education may have gone beyond the classroom doors. Does anyone, well, I don't expect you to. The last time there was a book published on the Williamsburg Bray School, which was in a large anthology of Bray School collection, was in 1985. That book is out of print. There has never been a sole book ever published on the history of the Williamsburg Bray School. And it's actually the Bray School Labs book that will be the first of its kind in the history of the United States to publish on the Williamsburg Bray School exclusively. So this is why I'm also so excited by all the questions you're asking, because the research is still ongoing for that very reason. We have to delve into hundreds of different archives to pull hundreds of different sources, because no one's collated them together in books or collections for us to pull from. So you're all asking wonderful questions that will also help with that research moving forward.
I'm going to just say that there have been a number of questions about education, the transfer of knowledge, the transfer of skill. If we look at the Bray Associates documents and their vision for these schools, their vision was to educate these children, but they very clearly imagined that they would take this education back to their household. So we think about whether boys might have learned to sew, for example, or others in the same household would have learned to read and potentially write. That is very much within the view, the purview, the mission of the Bray Associates, thinking about these schools. So I think your questions are very well suited to this. And I think that the answers are, if it was not formally taught in the confines of the building itself, it may have been taught in the extension of that teaching taking place less formally in those households. Do we have another question?
Yes,
Yes,
I have actually two very basic, easy to answer probably questions. The first, so I'll ask them both. The first, I kind of feel like I might be the only person in the room that doesn't completely understand what a sampler is, what its function was. And also I wanted to ask, are they typically of the size that you took out of the bag? And then my second question is whether or not any of the Bray School records indicate who the parents of the children were. Thank you.
Yeah, I can answer both of those questions, actually. The former, a sampler is usually in the 18th century, especially if we're looking to the mid to last quarter of the 18th century. A piece of stitch work, usually done on linen with silk thread. Again, it doesn't really move to wool until the 1820s. They can be of all different sizes. Samplers from Isle of Wight from this time period are in long called band samplers. Those are more really reflective of early 18th century and latter 17th century samplers. By the time we move into the 18th century, especially the last quarter, they're more almost 8 by 12 in size and shape, but they can be of any varying size or range of sizes. Usually they are meant to show the proficiency and needlework skill, as well as the religious understanding and theology of young girls. Hence why you see marking stitches, chain stitches, Irish stitches. Those are some very common examples. Satin stitches are another great example, French knots on all of this sampler work, because they're showing the sample skill of the young girl, but they're also supposed to reflect religious ideology, whether she can stitch the alphabet or letters, religious motifs. So I hope that answers your first question. Correct. It is meant to be a sample unto itself. Yeah. And there are also 18th century samplers of knitting that you see, and darning as well, that are very good examples. We don't have any that are really contemporaneous for the Williamsburg Bray School, but you do see knitting and darning samplers later on in other regions as well. When it comes to students, I'm so glad you asked this question. This is a great example of ongoing research that we're very fortunate at the lab to have the time and resources for. So I worked with a group of undergraduates and volunteers. We went through the entire Bruton Parish baptismal record and combed it carefully to go through every single student that was in there and trace back. It's just the starting point. But we can say of those 86 students, we can identify 20% of their parents, at least one parent. If you want to go and see this work today, I recommend you go actually to the Bray School CW webpage. You scroll down and you see something called the Bray School map. It was done in partnership with the entire initiative. You zoom into the houses that are in red, you click on them, you will see the students' names, the years they attended the school, their parents, if we can identify them, their enslaver, the overall occupation for the house, a photograph of the building if it is still extant, an identifier if the building is still extant, and it directly links to research reports, virtual tours, or digital maps connected to each one of those buildings. So you can go and do that today if you want.
Right. So also that is another aspect of how the technology is able to bring the story of the Bray School to life. But I also want to mention that we know that a small fraction of the known children, we are actively trying to find more and more lists.
Yes.
Known children were drawn from the free Black population. And for most of those children, which is only a few in number, they have a first and last name, they have parent name and some indication of occupation for at least some of those children. The Bray School Lab has a robust website. If you go just to the William and Mary website, wm.edu, and put Bray or Bray School Lab in, it will take you there. We have a number of links that will take you to, under research and engagement in particular, there are a number of tabs that give you information concerning our search for more descendants. There is a really vital document that was crafted within the lab that takes the 3 known lists of students with their names and what we call sometimes called sending households, the enslaving households, and also recognizing the free children, and organizes that according to household. So it becomes now much more of a genealogical tool than simply a transcription of those 18th century documents. We also have the connection to the research portal, which has the transcriptions of those documents pertaining to the Williamsburg School. And that is where you will see in the near future, increasing number of tabs that you can listen to the audio reading of those letters. We are recording individuals reading those letters and uploading that. And that project called the Voices Project is being spearheaded by Nicole, but also by Grace Helmick, who is our educational media technician in Bray School / Office of Strategic Cultural Partnerships, which is the umbrella office within which the Bray School Lab lives. So ongoing research and production of information and sharing it as quickly as we be able to vet it and get it up on the website. We are doing that. And we're very happy to partner with William and Mary Libraries on that research portal to make those materials much more accessible. So I definitely encourage people to do some more exploring, but simply know that it's there and that we're adding to it, just as we have recently added to our team, adding our oral historian, Tanya Meredith, and our genealogist, Elizabeth Drimbus, both full-time members of our team. We are out of time.
Yes.
I've already got the time signal. So thank you. And anything else after this, we will move to more informal.
And yes, please give our panel a wonderful hand. Wonderful job. Absolutely. So it is time for lunch. And we have boxed lunches. If you would like to further visit with our speakers, I'm sure afterwards they will be available to take questions.
Yeah, we're here.
But this has ended the session, so we're going to do lunch. You're welcome to come back to this room, or you can go out to the patio, wherever you desire. Thank you again for joining us. And we return at 12:30.
And I was like, oh no.
You all are.